Hello everyone and welcome to Ask Better Questions, the podcast where we delve into the nuances of leadership and personal development. I'm your host Peter, and today we're going to discuss what challenges I see will be the greatest challenges for leaders today and in the future. So for those of you who are new here, I'm Peter Adams. I have over 20 years experience in leadership and consulting. I'm a published author and a speaker in the leadership space, and my mission is to help excellent leaders become exceptional leaders through a better mindset. Before we start today's episode, I'd like to take a minute to thank our sponsor, Color4 Solutions. Color4 Solutions offer leadership training for people who have reached a ceiling in their leadership journey and want to achieve more without dedicating substantial time and effort. So I'm going to start today's episode by explaining why I started this podcast. Why leadership? Well, the short answer is that this leadership is a thread that ties everything together. Let me explain. When I was a child, my parents and grandparents explained why they fled Europe to come to Australia. They were offered three countries: Australia, Canada, and Venezuela. And without dwelling too much on it, Australia was warm, Canada was cold, and Venezuela was crazy. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. Venezuela was actually the richest of all three when they were considering. However, English was a stronger language, so they thought they'd pick either Australia or Canada, and Canada is just far too cold. Even Canadians will agree with me on that one. And arguably, they picked probably the choicest of the lot, given that Venezuela has fallen off the perch of being the richest country at the time. And Canada and Australia both have socialised healthcare and various other things that they thought they wanted. Ultimately, my granddad explained that Europe had become ruled by tyrants, and the West was free. The prevailing view was that it was free. Most Western governments would try to hide the fact that they did pretty much the same things that tyrants did, and if they didn't, they would soon enough anyway. Arrest dissidents, spy on populations, control access to information, utilize propaganda, that sort of thing. There isn't a government in the West that isn't openly doing exactly those things now, but at the turn, or just after the war, we're talking Second World War here, these things were frowned upon. Now they're considered pretty much everyday things that no one bats an eyelid at. The belief was that only Eastern Bloc countries did those sorts of things. But I digress. They weren't fleeing towards good leadership. They were running towards economic opportunity, so to speak. And that is something that still happens to this day. Most undeveloped countries, their populations flee to second world or even first world countries, which are typically Western countries, and they're fleeing not towards good leadership, but towards economic opportunities. Largely, economic opportunities in the West are currently being squandered, and that's not really a question. There are some that are being embraced, AI being one of them, but that's not exclusive to the West. A much larger problem is the widening, or the prevalence of a widening wealth gap between the rich and the middle class in most of the West. Now, this has been identified by many commentators, but largely completely it's been misdiagnosed. The widening wealth gap isn't the problem, it's actually the function of the system. And when you understand that central banks and inflation are key to this, let's take a moment to actually discuss why we have this widening wealth gap and what role central banks and inflation actually play as part of that. So a lot of commentators, a lot of media personalities, people that don't know any better, refer to the CPI or the Consumer Price Index as inflation. It's not inflation. The CPI is a measure of inflation. It's actually a measure of price movements. Now, there's a lot of problems with the CPI because it's an average, and whenever you average anything, you will always come up with a very meaningless figure that is easily manipulated, and the CPI is very easily manipulated. Inflation typically, at least classically in economics, referred to an increase in the money supply greater than the corresponding increase in GDP over a period of time. So you had inflation over time where money supplies expanded faster than an economy expanded. Take, for instance, an island that has 4 fish and 4 rocks. It's fairly simple to decide how much each fish is going to cost, 1 rock each. But if you doubled the amount of rocks, you still have the same economy. It's just now it's twice as many rocks. So effectively, you haven't really created any more wealth, but you are measuring a GDP with twice as many rocks. Therefore, you could say that it's twice as big. It's not. It's just inflation. It's a money supply increase. Now, the modern economics measures GDP in the unit of currency that is created by central banks. So this circular system is by its very definition inflationary. So case in point, the USA is currently borrowing or printing $1 trillion every 100 days for public service debt. So that's the federal government debt. That's not state governments, that's not local municipalities, that is just the federal government, adding $1 trillion every 100 days, over and above what it takes in taxation. So that means they have to print that money, and that is an enormous amount. Now, is $1 trillion worth of value being created every 100 days? Because if it is, then we are truly living in the best economic times ever in history. Now, whilst I do believe we are living in the best time in history, access to clean water, access to technology, it's a truly unique time to be alive, and it's fantastic. But is it the best economic times in terms of growth? That's a different question entirely. It's a much harder sell, and anyone that tells you it is probably lying to you, at least misleading you in many respects. The wealth gap continues to widen as the wealthy asset owners grow their wealth through increased asset prices, being inflation. The middle class spend an increasing amount on day-to-day living expenses and shrinking overall wealth, which probably sounds familiar to most people, realizing that the cost of everything is going up. And the poor, as I am often quoted as saying, well, $0 adjusted for inflation still buys nothing. Regardless of what the dollar does, increases, inflates, deflates, doesn't matter. If you've got nothing, you can still afford to buy nothing. So without being a doomer, what are we to do with all this information? Well, prepare. And there are numerous circumstances in history which we can point to where high inflation has presented itself. We can look at the countries that have had hyperinflation in recent decades. Some of them are still having it, Venezuela in point. Ask a Venezuelan what to expect. Prices in many businesses change twice each day in that country, and in many places in that country still do. So how do you charge for a service in a country experiencing a 100% inflation rate, or several 100% inflation over the course of a year? Can you book a dentist? You would have no idea what it costs. Can you pay an accountant, a lawyer, a mechanic, a plumber? Well, you can, but nobody knows what those things are going to cost until they complete the work. So you can book them 2 weeks out, but you have no idea what you'll be up for. There's also added uncertainty. Like, there are no credit terms. There's no 30-day terms, no 7-day terms. You pay when they hand you the invoice, or you're going to come to fisticuffs. You have to pay when the jobs are done. You have to pay employees daily, and some businesses pay them more than once a day. You also don't want to sit on cash, so your payroll is frequently just the only cash that you will sit on. Everything else is converted into goods, stock, other assets. You don't want any excess cash because you don't want to avoid losing any of the value. Now, how that works in practice is a nightmare for businesses to try and figure out. Now, I hear you say, like, okay, we get it. Inflation bad. But what does this have to do with leadership? Well, I return to why I started the podcast, why I trained leaders. I see too many people today refusing to prepare, refusing to call out corrupt systems, refusing to not partake in these systems. Instead, I see bankers and politicians and media and many others riding the systems all the way into the ground. I see academics gleefully celebrating the demise of society. Yay, we were right. Well, that's not going to actually help anyone. I see moral bankruptcy and hedonistic approaches to life held up as aspirational ideals. I see people celebrating the celebrityhood. I see a complete void where culture, values, and leaderships once stood, not because we want this, but because the systems demand it. Anyone who's met the average CEO or politician knows that often genuinely good people work towards these roles, but by the time they arrive at a place where they can make meaningful impact, they're so twisted and changed that they can't do these things. They can't make those decisions. And they often make incredibly poor and sometimes seemingly evil decisions. And, I asked myself why. And I got some of the answers from Philip Zimbardo's book, The Lucifer Effect. Now, the book explores the concept that good people can be induced to do evil things under certain circumstances. He argues that situational forces play a powerful role in shaping human behavior, and that even ordinary people have the capacity for cruelty. Now, this makes sense to me once you understand economics, and one of the key rules in economics is that people respond to incentives. Now, it's not the first rule of economics. The first rule of economics is that resources are finite. But economics tries to explain the allocation of resources. But it also is a model of human behavior. So understanding human dynamics and that people respond to incentives is key in understanding economics. So if you want to know what people will do, understand their incentives and you'll be able to determine what actions they are likely to take. So with this knowledge, why am I here? Why am I doing this? Well, I'm here to change the world. I want tomorrow's leaders, today's leaders too. I want both to understand that in order to achieve the best outcomes, we need to make the right and ethical decisions today. And how do we do that? Well, we create systems that reward good decision-making. Now, we don't have that at the moment, and designing those is a lot harder. We can't heal the past. We can't bring back extinct animals. We can't stop poison, Well, we can. We can stop poisoning the oceans. We can treat everyone with respect. We can start making differences. But I want leaders to make positive contributions to the world. And I want to clarify, not appear to make contributions, not sound like they're making a positive impact. I mean, actually make a positive impact. And in that regard, I want to go on record. Intention means nothing when trying to make a positive impact. Oh, I thought I was doing the right thing. Wind farms that destroy rare bird species, or monoculture tree plantations for carbon reduction that destroy biodiversity are examples of well-meaning environmental programs that have negative consequences. As you can see, those are just environmental examples. Making a net positive impact is much more challenging than many people will ever know or understand. So how do we go about doing that? Well, the best way of achieving positive change is to build those systems that support sensible decision-making and measuring what the outcomes are so that you can make changes. Now, when I grew up, we reused bags because it made sense, not because someone passed a law, not because somebody said, you've got to do this. We did it because it made sense. We reused soft drink bottles. Then we moved to a throwaway culture. GM is credited with having invented inbuilt obsolescence. Now, this invention is possibly the single biggest negative invention the world has ever seen. The negative externalities from an economic standpoint of that, from the throwaway culture are truly staggering, like enormous. So I challenge each and every one of you today to actually think. Sit down and think, how can I make this world a better place? What can I do? What decisions can I make today? Now, sometimes there are no good choices. Recognize that sometimes it's choosing between two evils. But recognize that, and as a leader, look for opportunities to choose better. Now, I'm going to leave today's episode of Ask Better Questions there. I've spoken for far too long about this, and I have different ideas of where I want to take this at this point, but I hope you found the insights from today's episode valuable and actionable. If you enjoyed today's episode, like and subscribe, and more importantly, share it with somebody you feel needs to hear this. I'll be back next week with more. Until then, keep asking better questions, and remember, leadership is not about having all the answers, it's about asking the right questions. Take care, and I'll see you back here next week.